That's you talk in the very beginning of the book. You liken this to experiences of citizenship,
Hmm.
what it means, Kathy, like asking the question of who gets to be like a real American.
Hmm.
Um, and you talk about this in context of belonging out of like racial identity, ethnic identity, gender. But I was thinking in reading this about like who gets to be called like a real citizen of the church.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and, as both of you have shared your sense of like belonging to
Hmm.
Christ through, I don't know, like to use this language, like a baptism in the Holy Spirit and your
Hmm.
participation with the global Big C church in the ways that you can, but not feeling like you can be a citizen of a local church at the moment. Not
Hmm.
without hope for something, perhaps, but
Yeah.
um, I just, if you had to think about, uh, for those of us who are sort of like, I'm a naturalized, I'm not a naturalized, I am a birthright citizen
Yes.
of the
Yes.
church, having
Same.
been
High
born
five.
into it, right? Yep.
Good job, us.
Thank
We
you.
did it.
Yeah. Way to go, mom and dad. And I think sometimes it can be hard when you feel like you belong, you don't question that you belong, to see those folks who are going to their cars to cry and then someday don't come back because we're so comfortable there. And it's hard to see the people in the pews around us who are struggling to wonder if they belong. Um, how do you think that the people who do feel like they belong might need to like think differently, act differently? How do we see differently, listen differently in order to be actually invitational and collaborative with those who haven't been born into whatever church context we find ourselves in?
Well, I'm curious to hear, Matt, what you would say, in part because I think right now there are so many angry white men.
Hey, hey.
um right, and in the state of the church, like I just
Yeah.
read something about like this is the first time where like young religious men outnumber religious women, but the power still is generally with folks like you, and so
Thank you. Thank you for acknowledging that. I appreciate it. Um, I think power is really important here, actually. In fact, I think it might be the core question because what happens is when we're protecting power, what we expect of people in the church is conformity.
Mm.
Everyone needs to come in line with what is correct according to my community. Now, that can be theological, right? And there are some theological guidelines we need just to be considered Christian. So I'm not saying throw everything out. But I know one of the struggles can be, let's say you don't fit in on not a core theology about Christ, but a side theology about a political issue or a sociological issue or the role of women in the church or LGBT or something about race, and you come into a church that disagrees and wants you to conform to their theological construct, it is very difficult not to continually be considered by yourself and others in the community as an outsider
Mm.
to the community. And I think that is a sign of a community that has oriented around power.
Mm.
Because right, what we're doing. Okay, I have a good example. I saw a pastor this week say on Twitter. So he's an angry white man pastor, and I can say that I recognize my people. He was saying if a woman shows up at church wearing leggings, that's inappropriate. And so I would ask her to leave. And she can go home and get dressed appropriately and then return. Right now, this is, I hope, an extreme. But what is this man saying? This man is saying, if you do not follow my expectation of behavior, of dress code, then I will cut you off from the community of faith and not give you access. which this is what a community oriented around power always ends up doing. It's conformity or removal.
Mm.
And I think organizations and communities that are oriented around the Spirit, if you look at the book of Acts, the entire book is about the Holy Spirit saying to the community of faith, oh, this person's an outsider? No, they're not. Let's bring them in. Over and over. That's the entire arc of the book. So I think when we are committed to the Spirit, what we find is we keep including more people into our community, not excluding. And that's incredibly difficult. It creates all sorts of problems, huge problems, difficult problems. It makes us uncomfortable. We're not like, oh, it's wonderful. We're all here and we all agree on everything. No, it's like, ugh, I feel awkward. I feel weird. Why does that person think that terrible thing? And it's painful. It's difficult, but it is also a hallmark of the Spirit empowered church.
Mhm.
So I don't know what you do with that.
And I
I
think
mean,
for Highrockers listening, Pastor Taylor preached recently about it's okay for churches to have boundaries in order to keep people safe.
for
So if
sure.
there
Oh,
is
100%.
someone who is causing active harm to
Yeah.
folks in the community, then a boundary needs to be set in order to do that.
Yes.
But I do,
Yes.
to your point, Matt, it's the question of like, what is actually harming the community? Is this
Right.
actually harmful, or is this a fear that I have that I'm unwilling to name? Right. In your example of the leggings, right? This reminds
Yes.
me of the documentary that just came out for our daughters that Kristen
Yes.
Kobes-Dume just recently released. That it, and they're talking about women being blamed for assault and objectification that male pastors like perpetrated on them.
Right.
But the women, the survivors in this documentary just kept talking about like it was their responsibility to dress a certain way so that the men were never tempted, that it was in the man's biological
It doesn't
DNA.
work, by the way. Just wanted to say,
Oh, good to
as
know.
a man,
Yeah.
we'll move the goalposts. Yeah. FYI.
But to that point, like, are the leggings inherently dangerous? Like,
No,
no, but you
of
have
course
some
not.
unaddressed fear that is making you want to, and maybe that's me assuming the best, to say that that's an unaddressed fear rather than saying you are trying to manipulate power. Control things.
Well, and I think
I
think Megan, you're right. Like the question is, when is the appropriate time to exercise power,
yeah.
right? And when we're saying, okay, someone who has been convicted of some sort of crime against children comes to your church and says, I'd like to join the children's ministry, the correct answer is no. Like, you're not allowed to do that, right? I exercise my power to protect those who are vulnerable in our community. And I don't say like, oh, I'm sure God has forgiven you and everything is fine. Like, there are places where it's appropriate to do that kind of lots of places where it's appropriate to use our power. What happens is when we're centered on power as a community, and then we force toward conformity rather than community, right? Because actually, to say to someone, "Hey, that's not an appropriate role for you in the church," in that example, right, where someone could potentially harm someone else, that's an appropriate use of power, and it actually builds community because we're saying to this person, "We're not kicking you out, but there are some guidelines that we need for your benefit as well as for theirs."
Yeah. And as somebody who was naturalized for the country into the country in terms of my citizenship and I wouldn't say I was born into the church in the traditional sense. Like my family, my parents, they've always been Christian. The first place we went to when we came to the US as a family, my first family picture is at a church, right? So, and my grandparents were Christians. So there is that, but there's something about the United States, the church here in the US. And I would say I'm not born into this space, is that we have always had rules around who belongs.
Mm-hmm.
We have always had rules. And when we don't acknowledge that, and we don't acknowledge who has had the power to write those rules, whether it is citizenship in the US or belonging in the church, local church, we don't acknowledge the power, we don't acknowledge the bias, we don't acknowledge all of that, then we have said belonging to the church is conformity as opposed to unity.
Mhm.
And so we preach unity, but really what we're demanding is conformity.
Mhm.
And when we don't know those rules, we don't understand that all of the signals you're giving to people who are new are telling them they don't belong.
Mm.
And so I would invite high rockers and other church leaders who may be watching or listening. The question you should be asking newcomers is not, how did you find us?
Mm.
Um, and are you coming back again?
Mm.
But the question should be, what didn't you understand about what we did?
Mm.
What confused you?
Mm.
What was strange, right? It's the things that you don't want to hear that I think are really important,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's things like, oh, why is everything decorated in these colors? Why do we only sing hymns, or why do we never sing hymns?
Mm.
Right? It's those types of signals that you give to people walking in that will be the bigger obstacles.
Mm.
That for people who belong, it's very normal.
Mm.
It's right. You just walk in and you understand. But because I think we have become newcomers to so many places, those are the things that we walk in and we're like, oh, that's interesting.
Mm.
That's it. Why? I wonder why they do it this way. Why do they do? Oh, they say this, but I've not seen a single woman. Oh,
Mm.
oh, they say this, but I've not seen, you know, a single young person. Oh,
Yeah.
they say this, but how is somebody supposed to get up all those stairs? Is there another
Mm.
entrance that I didn't see?
Mm.
Things like that, I think, are as important as any other programming a
Mhm.
church might do.
Mm.
Can I'm really good at negative examples. Can I give you a positive example of a church doing it well? I was part of a church here in the Portland area, Portland, Oregon, that started out as a white church, and they realized that they didn't, that was really weird because they lived in a multi-ethnic community. And so they went and hired a Korean pastor. And the church pretty rapidly grew into about a third Korean within 2 years, I think. Because what was happening, and you all will know all about this, right? Is Korean parents who had come from Korea realized that their kids didn't love the Korean speaking church, didn't love going to it, and they wanted a place where they could interact more like they were used to, right, at school and whatnot. So as the church grew, obviously there's some theological and cultural different. Like I remember once I was about to throw away a plastic tablecloth, and a Korean auntie came over and was like,
No, you
"What
wiped
are
it
you
down
doing?" She
and
like
you
wiped it down and folded it. I was like, "I can do that. Okay. Yeah, sorry." She was not pleased. I learned a lesson. But here, well, my favorite example is this. So conformity, right? Power would lead us to conformity, whereas the spirit leads us to community.
Mm.
I was with some I was with some folks, and we were talking about the theology of the church. I was a deacon by this point, like an elder in the church at this point. And there was a guy who said, "Our church does not believe in speaking in tongues," which historically had been true in this church. Um, and what they didn't know was that 5 a.m. Korean prayer service that happened every single morning that all the Korean aunties and
yes,
uncles went to,
yes,
they weren't speaking Korean when they were praying all the time,
yeah,
right? They were also
yep.
speaking in tongues. And one of our pastors actually just very quietly and he said, please don't go make this a thing. Please don't go passing this all around in the congregation. But I want to tell you, some people in our church do speak in tongues when
Mm.
they pray, and that's okay. And we didn't do it in the main service, right? But there was a place for those who spoke in tongues to pray in tongues. And I think that's really beautiful, actually. I don't pray in tongues. I'm not like angrily opposed to it, but my Korean brothers and sisters did, and they were allowed to be in the church and do that, and at a church sponsored event at 5 a.m. So there weren't any white people at it, but there you go. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I think that's beautiful. I think that's wonderful, right? That's where we weren't exercising power to say, hey, if you're speaking in tongues, this probably is not your church.
And I think it would be interesting now to say, like, has any of that moved into the main service? Like,
Right.
would folks be free to
Well,
feel like they could? Um,
so it is interesting. I think the culture of the church has shifted. One of the
mm,
things that happened is the head pastor was white.
mm,
And when he retired, beloved, he was one of those guys, right? He didn't have any sort of he never did he had his issues and his strengths, but he never did anything disqualifying. Everyone loved him. He retired, and two pastors later, got a Korean American second generation pastor who had actually studied under our pastor,
mm,
who ended up becoming pastor. And that did open up to different cultural expressions, particularly in the main service in a way that's really beautiful.
mm,
But yeah, our church was hiring interpreters early on, right? So that
Mm.
people could sit. We started singing some songs in Korean, which we had already been doing some of that. When you walked into the church, you were handed a card that showed you how to greet people in like five different languages because of the different languages spoken in
mm.
our church. So that was cool when we were passing the peace, Kathy. You could
Yeah.
go like Anyang Haseo, or like
Yes. Yeah.
you could try to say something.
Yeah.
We had to hire lawyers because a lot of our folks were actually migrant workers from
Mm,
Latino
Hmm.
backgrounds. And many of them were undocumented. And our church
Hmm.
quietly, right? Not a big thing that we talked about on Sundays, but our
yeah.
church was quietly taking care of our
Mm,
people who were running into, they were being misused either by their
Yeah.
employers or by the legal system of the US. So our church had to hire a lawyer to help with that.
Yeah.
wow.
Um, yeah, I think those are all beautiful things, right? Those are the things that go
Right.
like, whoa, what your community is different. That's weird.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.